meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. In the late Victorian era, dozens, if not hundreds, of bicycle makers across the world got into the motorcycle or car business, or both. And if you look at the first model automobiles made by these various bike makers, you'll notice that most of their early cars are a lot like bicycles. They tend to be small and light. They use a lot of the same parts as contemporary bicycles and are often made with the same tools. So what kind of car would be made by someone who owned a company that built locomotives? Well, you're just gonna have to keep watching to find out what kind of cars were made by Paul Decauville. Now, anyone who is seriously into European railroad history has most likely heard of this fellow. Born in a small suburb of Paris, France in 1846, Paul Decauville's family were wealthy, well-known, and respected, owning a gigantic farm that produced a significant amount of France's annual consumption of sugar beets. Young Paul grew up on the farm and thus learned how to run it, but he was also sent to excellent schools where he showed a natural affinity with mechanical engineering. He was simply a born inventor. He graduated with his engineering degree from the St. Barbe College in 1864 and returned to the family farm to help his aging father. He was hands-on with the daily farm management and also very active politically, becoming an activist for French farmers' rights as a whole. Indeed, he was one of the founding members of the Society of Farmers in France, and their very first meeting, held in 1868, was held on his farm. This meeting was significant, as one of the main topics for discussion was the use of various steam-powered vehicles and tools in farming, their advantages and disadvantages at the time. Paul noted that although steam power could do mundane and repetitive jobs more efficiently, their main disadvantage was logistical. They were not easy to move around. True that traction engines could move on their own and could power a variety of tools, but this itself caused a problem. Steam power could pick crops faster than the crops could be removed from the field. The various veggie piles all over the place made moving huge traction engines without crushing valuable veggie piles quite challenging. Paul set his gift of invention to work on the problem and by 1876 came up with a solution. His solution was a miniature train. Consider this. If you want to have a model train to play with in your home, you can go to a hobby store and buy ready-made sections of track. And you can get all sorts of sections. Straight ones, curved ones, ones with intersections, forks, whatever you need to complete the meandering path you want the train to take. Now, do exactly this except with a life-sized train. Well, not quite life-sized. His tracks were called narrow gauge, and the rails were only about 2 feet apart instead of the over 4.5 feet of a standard railroad track. Obviously, a full-sized locomotive wouldn't fit on such a track, but a smaller one would, and so Decauville began to build miniature tracks and trains. His sections of track were small and light enough that one man could carry them short distances. They were still kind of cumbersome. And since the locomotives and loads they carried were not as large and heavy, less prep work was needed to make the roadbed for the tracks, if at all. The track sections locked into place together, just like model train tracks do today. And once the tracks were down, you could drop your train onto it, and off you go. Paul set up tracks in beet fields and beyond, eventually laying track to the nearest standard gauge line, thus making an intermodal. Now the beets could be removed as fast as they were picked, and within only a few years, his railway system spread across the world. Mining operations, farming, logging, passenger services, and many other industries put Decauville tracks and trains to work and made him unbelievably wealthy. It was in 1897 that Decauville decided to get into the car business. He had some relationship with the industry, as he had been making various components for Decauville Bouton for a few years by then and had gotten to know a few key automotive people. He wanted to make a car that was like his locomotives, small, light, and nimble. He heard about and then bought a design put together by a small engineering partnership run by two fellows, Messrs. Guedion and Cornelio, of which the latter Paul hired to be his chief engineer. Their first model debuted in 1898. Named the Voiturelle, she sported a twin-cylinder De Dion engine of about 3 horsepower and a 2-speed rear transaxle. Though with all of the gears exposed, it was a bit noisy in operation. The car weighed less than 800 pounds wet and was a direct competitor with the cycle cars of the period. Yet there was one feature of this car that stands out. If you look at the front axle, you'll notice the rather odd spring behind the headlamp. The center of that spring is mounted at a swivel point. That suspension system is the grandfather of modern independent front suspension, though it is true that the rear axle has no suspension at all on the car. Decauville continued to make cars until 1911, when he refocused on his locomotive business as well as some other new ventures. His cars were very much like his locomotives, small, light cars similar to the ones bike makers made. And one particular manufacturer of electrical components bought one of these Voiturelles used in 1903, but he wasn't happy with it, and so Henry Royce made his own car as a result of this, and the rest is history. Paul Decauville is, as I mentioned, quite famous in railroad history. Yet the small cars he made for a short period of time were the catalyst that resulted in the eventual creation of Rolls-Royce. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.